Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be tackling a subject that's absolutely crucial for any UPSC aspirant, especially those of you focusing on international relations,
Yes.
the women's movement, and its impact on global politics. But even if you're not prepping for exams, I think this is going to be a fascinating look at how power dynamics have shifted. On the world stage,
For sure.
we are diving deep into an excerpt from a text that really unpacks this complex relationship between the women's movement and global politics. And let me tell you, some of the insights are truly surprising.
Yeah, it's true. The history of the women's movement is full of twists and turns, things that challenge our assumptions about how social change happens.
Exactly. For example,
Yeah.
did you know that one of the first big wins for the movement, women getting the right to vote, actually led to a decline in its momentum? I mean, it seems counterintuitive, right?
It does.
You would think
Yeah.
achieving such a major goal
Right.
would energize the movement even further.
You would think so. But what's fascinating is that the early women's movement, what we call the first wave, was so focused on suffrage that once that goal was achieved, there was this kind of sense of, well, what now? That
Yeah.
unifying purpose was gone.
So it's like they climb Mount Everest, they plant their flag, and then have to figure out which mountain to tackle next.
Exactly. Precisely. And this period of relative quiet lasted for a few decades until the 1960s, when the second wave of feminism emerged.
The 60s, a time of radical social movements.
Yes. And this wave was much broader in its scope, aiming for deep cultural change, not just political reform. Think challenging traditional family structures, fighting for equal pay, raising awareness about issues like domestic violence.
So we're seeing the women's movement shift from a primarily Western suffrage-focused movement to something much more global and multifaceted. And I'm guessing this is where it starts to have a serious impact on international relations, right?
Absolutely.
Especially for UPSC folks.
Yeah.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely. While the initial radicalism of the second wave subsided, the movement continued to evolve and gain a significant international dimension. Think about it. As more women gained access to education and entered the workforce, they began to influence policy, participate in international organizations, and challenge traditional power structures on a global scale.
Okay, so we've got this growing movement, making its presence felt on the world stage. But did it actually lead to concrete changes? I mean, social movements can be powerful.
Yeah.
But how do we know if they really make a difference in the long run? Measuring that impact seems tricky.
It is tricky. But in this case, the evidence is pretty compelling. Think about the changes we've seen, especially in Western societies. Increased access to education and careers for women, reproductive rights, greater legal and financial independence, and bringing issues like violence against women to the forefront.
These are huge shifts, not just tweaks to the system. It's not just about laws. It's about a fundamental shift in values and expectations. And this wasn't just happening in isolation.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah. The global community started paying attention.
The UN and organizations like the World Bank began incorporating concepts like human development and gender mainstreaming.
Okay, stop right there. Gender mainstreaming. That's a term our UPSC listeners will definitely need to know. Can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean in practice?
Essentially, gender mainstreaming means integrating a gender perspective into all policies and programs. Instead of treating women's issues as a separate concern, it recognizes that gender impacts every aspect of society and development.
So it's not just about having a women's rights department tucked away somewhere, but actually making sure that every department, from economics to healthcare, considers the unique needs and experiences of both men and women.
That's the idea. It's a shift from add women and stir to baking gender considerations into the very cake of policymaking. And this shift is largely thanks to the persistent advocacy of the women's movement.
So we're seeing this movement not only changing laws and social norms, but also influencing the way international institutions operate. That's pretty impressive.
It is. But as with any social movement, the women's movement hasn't been without its critics and internal debates.
Of course.
Some argue, for example, that the advancements we've seen in gender equality are actually more a product of capitalist modernity than feminist activism.
Hold on. That's an interesting take. How does capitalism fit into this picture? I'm all ears, especially since we're trying to connect the dots between the women's movement and global politics.
The argument goes that capitalist societies, by their very nature, value individuals based on their productivity. As economies evolve, and demand for skilled labor increases. It becomes economically beneficial to utilize the talents of all members of society, including women.
Right.
So in this view, capitalism itself incentivizes greater gender equality.
So it's not necessarily about some altruistic belief in equality, but rather a cold, hard calculation of economic efficiency. That's a pretty cynical take, but I can see how some people might arrive at that conclusion.
It is a provocative argument, and it's just one of many criticisms leveled at the women's movement. Another critique is that the sexual revolution, often associated with second-wave feminism, remains incomplete.
Yeah, I can see that. We've come a long way. But true gender equality is still elusive, even in the most developed nations.
Exactly. Women are still underrepresented in leadership positions across various sectors, and the division of household labor remains unequal in many places. These are issues that continue to be debated and fought for, even today.
And then there's the issue of the movement itself becoming fragmented, right?
Precisely. As the women's movement grew and diversified, different strands of feminism emerged, each with its own set of goals and approaches. Sometimes these goals even clash, leading to internal debates and disagreements about the best way to achieve gender equality.
So we've got internal divisions within the movement, external criticisms from those who believe feminism has gone too far, and this ongoing debate about whether capitalism deserves more credit than activism for the progress we've seen. It's a complex landscape, to say the least.
It certainly is. But despite the criticisms and internal debates, the women's movement has undeniably left its mark on global politics. And one of the ways we can understand this impact is through the concept of gender lenses.
Ooh, gender lenses.
Yeah.
That sounds intriguing. I'm guessing this is a key concept for our UPSC aspirants to grasp. Can you shed some light on what it means to view international relations through these gender lenses?
Of course. Essentially, applying a gender lens means analyzing international relations through the lens of gender dynamics. It's about recognizing that gender is not just a demographic category. It's a system of power relations that influences everything from economics to security to diplomacy.
So it's not just about adding more women to the mix,
Yeah.
but about fundamentally changing the way we think about power itself.
Exactly. And there are two main approaches to using gender lenses: empirical feminism and analytical feminism.
Okay, so empirical feminism,
Yeah.
sometimes referred to as add women and stir, focuses on highlighting the often invisible roles that women play in global politics. Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think about the roles of migrant workers, often women, who contribute significantly to global economies. Or the role of diplomats' wives, who often engage in unofficial diplomacy. And cultural exchange. Empirical feminism aims to bring these contributions to light.
That makes sense. It's about recognizing the contributions women are already making, even when they're not in positions of formal power. And what about analytical feminism? How does that approach differ?
Analytical feminism goes deeper, aiming to uncover the gender biases hidden. Within traditional international relations theories, it challenges the masculine assumptions embedded in concepts like power and national interest.
So while empirical feminism might focus on the role of women in conflict resolution, analytical feminism might critique the very definition of security itself, questioning whether it prioritizes male-dominated notions of military strength over other forms of security, like economic or social well-being.
Exactly. Analytical feminism would argue that traditional security frameworks often overlook the vulnerabilities faced by women and other marginalized groups. And this brings us to a really crucial point. For our UPSC aspirants, understanding these different gender lenses is essential for analyzing complex global issues.
I completely agree, if you want to ace those exams. And more importantly, contribute to a more just and equitable world. You can't just rely on the old male-dominated paradigms of international relations.
You hit the nail on the head. These gender lenses are powerful tools for understanding the world in a more complete and nuanced way.
This has been incredibly insightful so far, but we've covered a lot of ground. For now, let's take a quick breather, grab a cup of chai.
And we'll be right back. To delve even deeper into this fascinating topic,
Welcome back.
Before the break, we were talking about gender lenses and how they help us analyze global issues in a more insightful way. Now I know, our UPSC aspirants are probably thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but how does it translate into actual policy and action?
That's a great question.
It is a crucial question.
It is.
Because these ideas aren't just floating in the academic ether, they're shaping real-world decisions.
Right.
In fact, we touched on one example before the break, gender mainstreaming.
Yes.
You explained how it means integrating a gender perspective
Right.
into all policies, not just treating it as a side issue.
Right. It's about recognizing that gender impacts every aspect of our lives and societies. So
Yeah.
policies should be designed with that understanding from the ground up.
So it's not about having a separate women's rights department,
Hmm.
but rather ensuring that every department, whether it's focused on economics, healthcare, or even defense,
So-
considers the unique needs and perspectives of both men and women.
Precisely. It's about moving beyond the idea that women's issues are somehow niche or separate from the mainstream.
This seems like a huge shift in thinking.
Yeah.
When did this concept of gender mainstreaming start gaining traction in international organizations? I'm betting our listeners are curious about the historical timeline here.
Wow. It really gained momentum in the 1990s, specifically after the UN's Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995.
Okay, so Beijing 1995, that's a landmark event. Our UPSC folks should definitely jot down what happened there that made it so significant.
Well, the Beijing Platform for Action, which came out of that conference, was groundbreaking. They provided a comprehensive roadmap for achieving gender equality and explicitly called for gender mainstreaming as a key strategy.
So this wasn't just some vague aspirational document. It was a concrete plan
Yeah.
with actionable steps for governments and organizations to take.
Exactly.
And it led to real change.
It did. Since then, many international organizations, including the UN and the World Bank, have adopted gender mainstreaming policies and programs.
Can you give us some specific examples of how this is played out in practice?
Yeah.
What does gender mainstreaming actually look like in the real world? I think concrete examples will really help our listeners grasp this concept.
Absolutely. For instance, in the fields of development, many projects now specifically target women as beneficiaries, recognizing that empowering women has a ripple effect on entire communities. There's also been a growing focus on collecting sex disaggregated data, meaning data that distinguishes between men and women, so we can better understand the unique challenges and opportunities faced by each gender.
That makes a lot of sense. If you don't have the data, you can't really design effective policies, right?
Exactly. It's like trying to navigate a city without a map.
And we see this emphasis on data collection.
Right. And gender analysis across various sectors. For example, in conflict zones, there's now a greater understanding of how armed conflict impacts women differently than men. And this understanding is informing humanitarian aid and peacekeeping efforts.
So we're seeing how the women's movement has pushed international organizations to adopt this gender mainstreaming approach, which in turn is leading to more effective and equitable policies. But what about the academic side of things? How are scholars incorporating these gender perspectives into their research on international relations?
That's where things get really interesting. Feminist scholars have been challenging traditional international relations theories, particularly realism, which, as you may recall, has historically dominated the field.
Yes. Just a quick reminder for our listeners. Realism tends to view the world as this competitive arena where states are constantly vying for power and security.
Right, and feminist scholars have pointed out that this realist framework often overlooks the experiences and perspectives of women. It tends to focus on state actors and military power, neglecting the role of non-state actors and the impact of conflict on civilian populations, which of course disproportionately affects women.
So feminist scholarship is pushing for a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of international relations, one that takes into account the lived realities of all people, not just those in positions of power.
Exactly. And this has led to the emergence of feminist international relations theory, which critiques traditional notions of power, security, and statehood.
Can you give us an example of how this theory plays out in practice?
Sure. For instance, feminist scholars might point out that national security isn't just about protecting borders from external threats. It's also about ensuring the safety and well-being of individuals within those borders, which includes addressing issues like domestic violence and gender-based discrimination.
That's such an important point. It broadens our understanding of what constitutes a threat to security, recognizing that violence and insecurity can manifest in many forms, not just interstate warfare.
Right.
And this brings us back to the question we posed earlier. How can we move beyond simply adding women to existing structures and truly transform the way we think about power and international relations in a gender-equal way?
That's the million-dollar question. It requires us to grapple with some fundamental assumptions about how the world works, for example. How do we move beyond the traditional, often patriarchal, structures of power that have shaped global politics for so long? And how do we ensure that the voices and perspectives of women are not just included, but truly valued and integrated into decision-making processes at all levels?
These are huge questions. And unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment. But don't worry. We're not done yet.
We're looking forward to wrapping up our deep dive.
We'll be back in just a moment to tackle those big questions and wrap up our deep dive into the women's movement and its impact on global politics. Don't go anywhere. We're back for the final part of our deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about some pretty big questions about how to really transform the way we think about power in international relations in a gender-equal way. And it's a tall order.
It is.
But you know what? It's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely.
Especially for those UPSC aspirants out there who are going to be shaping the future of global politics.
Right. It really requires us to think critically and creatively about this.
So where do we even begin? I mean, we've talked about the history of the women's movement,
Right.
the concept of gender mainstreaming, the emergence of feminist international relations theory. These are all important pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But how do we put them all together to create real lasting change?
Well, I think one crucial step is to move beyond the idea that simply adding women to existing structures is enough. We need to fundamentally rethink those structures themselves.
You're right. It's not just about having more women in positions of power. It's about questioning how that power is defined and exercised in the first place.
Exactly.
We need to challenge those traditional, often patriarchal assumptions that underpin many of our institutions and policies.
Right.
For example, how do we redefine security to encompass not just military strength, but also economic and social well-being, particularly for women and marginalized groups?
Yeah.
How do we ensure that peace negotiations and agreements prioritize the needs and perspectives of women, not just the interests of male combatants?
It's such an important point.
These are such important quotients.
Yeah.
And they require us to think outside the box, to imagine new models of leadership, governance, and global cooperation.
Absolutely.
For, I think, the younger generation out there, particularly those preparing for the UPSC exams, have a crucial role to play in this transformation.
It really is.
They're the ones who are going to be shaping the future of India and its role in the world.
Yeah, you are.
You are the future diplomats, policymakers, and thought leaders, and the knowledge and the insights you gain from studying these issues, from understanding the history and theory of the women's movement and its impact on global politics will be invaluable as you navigate the complexities of the 21st century.
It's about bringing fresh perspectives,
Yeah.
challenging old assumptions, and advocating for a more inclusive and equitable world.
So to our UPSC aspirants, we urge you to embrace these challenges. Don't shy away from those complex questions. Dig deep into the research, engage in critical discussions, and be bold in your vision for a better future.
I agree with all of that.
And remember, this journey of learning and unlearning is not just for those preparing for exams. It's for all of us.
It really is.
The fight for gender equality is a collective effort. It requires all of us to listen to diverse perspectives, to challenge our own biases, and work together to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of gender. It's about creating a world where power is not a zero-sum game, but a force for positive change. A world where security means not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice, and where international relations are guided by principles of cooperation, empathy, and respect for all.
That's a great vision.
And on that note, we come to the end of our deep dive into the women's movement and its impact on global politics.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It has. We've barely scratched the surface of this complex and ever-evolving topic. But we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more. And if you're prepping for the UPSC, this is definitely a subject you'll want to keep exploring.
Yes, and for those of you taking the exam, we encourage you to delve deeper into the specific policies and initiatives related to gender equality, both in India and on the global stage.
And don't forget to check out the resources we'll be sharing in the show notes. We've got links to articles, books, and organizations that can help you deepen your understanding of this crucial topic.
And for everyone listening, whether you're a UPSC aspirant or simply someone who is passionate about creating a more just and equitable world, we encourage you to continue the conversation.
Yes.
Share your thoughts with us in the comments, connect with us on social media, and let's keep learning and growing together.
Before we sign off, we have a small request. If you enjoyed this deep dive and found it valuable, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with your friends and networks. The more people we can engage in these conversations, the closer we get to creating the kind of world we all want to live in.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future.